Unknown participant is now joining.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so before we get started, make sure that you have your mics muted so that way we don't have any of that background noise going on. So, to let you know, I will be getting to the Unit 1 grading this weekend. So it will be done by Sunday. Today we are going over Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Chapter 4 being political parties. So for political parties, the definition of this, it includes people and interests with the goal of gaining control by winning elections. So political parties basically use these candidates in these elections to be able to obtain their different platform interests. They're chiefly concerned with recruitment, so trying to recruit people, regular old people like me and you, business people, people at the state level, people at the national level. They depend on these nominations within their parties and the election of citizens to office because that is how they get their party's platform pushed. So we do have a two-party system in Texas. So it has traditionally been dominated by one party. So it was the Democrats from the 1800s until the 1990s. To get a huge asterisk here, this Democrat Party that you see right here is completely different from the one that we know today. Okay, we'll be going over the differences in that. And then the Republican Party from 1990 to around 2018, we started to become more of a swing state around 2018. So right now our state is in the process of being able to swing either way, which we will probably see happen in our next election with our representatives and our governor to see which way it goes. So we have two types of representation systems. Okay, there is proportional representation and single member district representation. So proportional representation, this is a method that other democracies use, not the United States. This would be places like Great Britain and like France. So basically what they do is they take an area and they divide it up. Okay, so each of these areas is known as one district, and they divide this district up. Okay, so what they do is they basically will take each party and give them the amount of votes that they got for that election. Okay, so over here we see that the Democrats got 3 votes from this district, the Republicans got 5, and the Green Party, known as the Independent Party, got 1. Okay, so in proportional representation, all of these groups would actually get these tallies. It is what makes the third party and fourth party systems in these nations so much more effective because they're actually able to have a chance at winning elections. But the United States uses is known as a single member district. So this is a winner take all approach. So basically, same conditions. We have 3 Democrats, 5 Republican, 1 Green Party. But since this is a winner-take-all approach, the Republican Party takes all 9 votes. Okay? So, conservatism. So whenever we're talking political ideology, this is referring to that conservative or that liberal idea. Okay, so over time these ideas have gotten to where they are associated with particular parties. So the conservatives, the right-wingers, They traditionally fall under the Republican Party. So these guys, they prefer social and economic systems that are largely untouched by the government. Our conservatives are opposed to government assistance. We have fiscal and social conservatives. So a fiscal conservative, also known as a Tea Partier, is one in which they do not like the government putting into place taxes or anything that deals with monetary or business regulation. Okay, social conservatives, this is dealing with social issues. So these guys are usually opposed to social assistance programs like Medicaid, food stamps, and they are opposed to abortion access and or LGBTQIA plus community rights. So our Tea Party movement, this is really what created a very strong fiscal conservative wing in our Republican Party. Tea Partiers were really concerned with taxes. The way you can remember that, the Tea Party actually comes from the Boston Tea Party, which remember was a protest against taxes against tea. So that is where they got the name from their party. They were opposed to taxes from the government. So it made the Republican Party more conservative. They were concerned with debt reductions. That means the national debt, to reduce that. They wanted less spending by the government and more tax cuts. So liberalism, that's the left wing, and they traditionally fall under the Democratic Party. So they favor government regulation of economy. Okay, this is talking about business regulation. Things like workers' rights, hours, safety concerns, ability to influence politics, all those things. They have a belief that the government is obligated to aid the unemployed, alleviate poverty, and guarantee equal rights. So they are for aid to the socially disadvantaged populations, which is programs like food stamps, Medicaid, and WIC. They believe in a limited government role in religion. In other words, a very set separation between the government and the church, known as a separation between church and state. Democrats' neoliberal ideology. So this is basically where there's less government involvement in the economy. So this is business practices, i.e., so for example, the minimum wage, and more government involvement in social programs. Okay, so if you notice there, they are a little more focused on their goals than these guys up here. So libertarianism. These guys, they will traditionally associate with the Republican Party, but as far as the libertarians go, they really don't fit all the way into either party because they believe in minimal government role in economic matters. That is a Republican ideal. And social issues, which is a Democrat ideal. Okay, so traditionally, economic conservatives fall under the Republican Party. So, for example, that minimal business regulation. Traditionally, social liberals fall under the Democratic Party. So, for example, minimal government regulation in marijuana regulation. Okay, this falls under social behaviors. So, because the Republican Party emphasizes business interests, and this is where libertarians' first priorities tend to lie, especially those within Texas. Libertarians often associate more with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. So, third party. So, these are guys that are not really belonging to the Republican or the Democratic Party. You'll often find that the ones that have popped up through history, the ones that have started to pop up more recently, they're more single interest parties. What that means is that they really concern themselves with one single goal. Okay, so for example, the Tea Party movement. So they believe in less taxes and business regulation. Okay, as you notice, this is very, very straight line, very straightforward on what they want. Okay, so these parties do tend to, because they cannot get votes through our single member district system, what they do is that they associate themselves with a party who more closely fits with their ideas. Okay, so this is what the Tea Party did. They essentially merged with the Republican Party. And then our Green Partiers, our environmental regulation guys, they fit more into our Democratic Party. And that's the way they usually go for our elections. So, Texas politics today is more partisan. A way to remember that word partisan, you see this word right here? Looks like party, right? It's party centered. So, both parties experience factionalism. So that means that it breaks into factions. So a lot of our nation throughout time has been very divided, especially over very controversial issues. So we notice that whenever this happens, that the parties themselves actually divide out. Okay, so to give you an example, we had the Democratic Party, let's say around the 1950s, 1960s. At that time, the Democratic Party started to support civil rights. Okay, but remember that Democratic Party was also in the South. Those in the South did not support civil rights for the most part. So we actually saw a splintering of the Democratic Party into different factions. Okay, the original Democrats, and then what was known as the Dixiecrats, who were the ones from the South. Okay, so Republican factions, they include conservative factions. So these are represented in Congress by the Republican Study Committee and the Freedom Caucus. So the Republican Study Committee, they work for significant cuts in non-defense spending. They support free trade agreements, and they advocate for socially conservative legislation. Our Freedom Caucus aligns itself on the right wing of the political spectrum, and certain members hold right-wing populist beliefs. Remember that is from the late 1800s, early 1900s, such as opposition to illegal immigration. Its members hold socially and fiscally, remember fiscally means money, conservative views, and are more supportive of Donald Trump. Okay, so these guys, our Freedom Caucus, were the ones who were behind Donald Trump during his presidency and during his campaign. So we have our moderate faction. So they are represented in Congress by the Republican Governance Group. They are in charge over our House Republicans. And then we have our Libertarian faction. So these are the Libertarians who associate more strongly with the Republican Party, those guys we just talked about. So, electoral trends. So, something to help you understand the Democratic Party, how it's changed. Because the Democratic Party that we know today is completely different from what it used to be. So, the Democratic Party in the early 1800s, this was the party of the South, okay? So, the Democratic Party has, for the most part, for most of American history until recently, has been for the white male. Okay, so a lot of their stances, a lot of their platform interests went towards supporting the white male. Okay, so putting that to your mind when we're talking about this throughout history, because it'll help you make a little bit more sense. So early in the 1800s, this was the party of the South. Okay, and remember, this is for the white males, right? So they were the ones in support of slavery. And then after Reconstruction, they were the ones who basically spearheaded those Jim Crow laws to be put into place after the Union left. Okay, mid-1900s, this was still a part of the South. They were against the expansion of civil rights and the civil rights era. So remember these guys, they were known as the Dixiecrats. Accidentally deleted something, there we go. Okay, so these guys were the Dixiecrats. Okay, remember those the faction that we talked about that split off? It wasn't until the 1990s that the Democratic Party really started to look like what we know now. This is whenever we started to see a strong support where they started to not only include the white male, but this was towards everyone. Okay, and when we're talking everyone, we're talking about your standard Joe, your standard Jane, right? Those working class, those type of people. So this was when we saw the Democratic Party really start to be in support of women's rights and civil rights. So de-alignment. So, as Texas's economy became more business oriented, our economy, we talked a little bit about this already, how our economy is very much based on business, things like technology and oil and the refineries over in Houston. Very big business type economy, right? So, as our economy has become more business oriented, we unaligned ourselves with the Democratic Party and then we realigned ourselves with the Republican Party. So, the Republican Party has and always has been in support of business interest and deregulation. They are the ones who are very much in support of laissez faire, meaning hands off, meaning the government lets the economy run the way that it needs to run with absolutely no interference. Okay? So Texas tried to end straight ticket voting by getting rid of the straight ticket option at the kiosk. So basically, those who wanted to straight ticket vote, meaning they only voted one party the entire time, they used to have a button where they could just press that button and basically just go ding, 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 and it'd just be Democrat all the way down or Republican all the way down. Now, people still, it has made almost no impact because people still just click through and just press Democrat the entire time or click through and just press Republican the entire time. So, independents. So, our independents, they have no party affiliation, meaning they don't really identify with anybody. They lack fundraising abilities. This is due to the track record of ability of third parties to gain political ground. Remember we talked about the single member districts? Independents have a really hard time gaining any kind of ground. So this means that these PACs, these super PACs, they do not put money towards these people because they statistically do not win. And you have to remember that these campaigns cost hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars. So it's a lot of money to put on an individual that statistically will not win. So our interest groups, lobbyists, they don't really put forth funding to these candidates. It's also really difficult to gain ballot access as an independent candidate. So you must have a petition signed by a registered voter who does not vote in the primary election. Okay? Lots of people, especially recently, have become a lot more politically active, right? So to find an individual that has not voted in the primary is already really hard, especially if they are a party loyal, right? Meaning somebody who very much associates with that political party. So it's really hard to find those individuals to sign the petition in the first place, okay? And it has to be signed by 1% of registered voters. So that means that that individual has to be able to get almost 50,000 signatures, okay, just to get on that ballot. So it's very, 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 very difficult to be able to do that. So 1840s to 1870s, an overview of our political history, how our state has looked. So remember 1840s to 1870s, that is when we were gaining our independence, whenever we became our own nation, and then early statehood, and then into the Confederacy, okay? So a whole bunch of change happened within this time period. So we had pro-Houston and anti-Houston, okay? And we're talking Houston, we're talking Sam Houston. So the two dominant factions were the pro-Sam Houston and the anti-Houston groups. Houston was opposed to secession. Okay, so those who were pro-Sam Houston were also opposed to secession. We talked a little bit about how it was already really, really, really hard for our state to gain statehood and to be annexed in the first place. So Sam Houston was very leery of us seceding because we had worked so hard to be annexed in the first place. So Jackson Democrats and Calhoun Democrats. So pro-Houston faction began referring to themselves as the Jackson Democrats, the Unionists, and the anti-Houston faction called themselves the Calhoun Democrats after South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun. He was a states' rights and pro-slavery advocate. Okay, so that means these guys over here, these Calhoun Democrats, they were pro-slavery, and these guys, these Jackson Democrats, these Unionists, were anti-slavery. So during the Civil War, the state basically united firmly under the Democratic Party. This was the party of the Confederacy. To go against the Confederacy at that time was very dangerous. Because you basically put a target on your back if you did that. So most of the state stayed under the Confederacy. We were Republican during Reconstruction. So the Republican Party, remember, that is the party that was Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so should help to help you remember. Since Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and the Union was therefore Republican at that time because that was the president during that time, the southern states that were joining back into the Union were also Republican because they had been taken over by the Union by military officials, basically, and so they were run under military rule for a little while. So we had Mr. Governor Davis, Republican Governor Davis, under this time. A lot of Texans did not like how he ran the state, and it was actually the inspiration for our Constitution that we use until today. So there is a lot of influence on the, when we get to the executive branch and we're talking about the governor, you'll see a lot of different ways to basically weaken the executive, the governor's branch, and that is because of Governor Davis. So go to the next one. So 1840s to 1870s. So the Democrats were strong. Sorry, I should say the 1870s to 1970s. The Democrats were strong and the Republicans were weak from the 1870s to the 1970s. The Democratic candidates, just to give you an idea how much of a one-party state we were and traditionally are, the Democratic candidates won 52 consecutive gubernatorial elections. This means that for 52 of our elections, they all were one party. Okay? So this is when our governor's term was 2 years instead of 4. So that meant for 104 years, our state voted nothing but Democrat. Okay? So the Populist Party was strong during the 1890s. So remember, the Populist Party makes sense whenever you think about it. They had their interests in agriculture, right? So the Populist Party was the party of Texas because Texas was largely an agriculture state. Okay? So, and I apologize about my dogs barking in the background. So we have two factions in the Democratic Party, conservatives and liberals. So there's the conservative Democrats during this time, which were pro-business and pushed for right-to-work laws. So that was works that weakened labor unions. And then we had liberal Democrats during this time that associated with the New Deal policies and the Roosevelt administration. So remember that 1930s falls right before that 1970s, right in between, right? And that is whenever it was the Great Depression era. Remember that President FDR was a Democrat, and he was the one who came up with these New Deal policies. So we did actually see some Democrats unalign themselves, become more conservative, and then we saw those who were very much in support of FDR, and they were the liberal Democrats. So Republicans came to power in the 1960s. but Latinos and African Americans began to impact the Democratic Party. So Texas Latinos and African Americans, they became more active in Texas politics, and they began to have an impact on the Democratic Party. So in particular, they had the potential to strengthen the liberal faction of the party, which was where we saw the Viva Kennedy clubs who were created in Texas. And we worked to elect John Kennedy as president during his 1960 election campaign. So the Republican Party made gains in the 1970s. So this is whenever we start to see that switch over. So the year 1978 was a watershed year for Republican success in Texas elections, meaning they basically took it. So William Bill Clements was elected governor in 1978. He was the first Republican to ever hold that office since Reconstruction. Remember, it was Democrats for 104 years. 1980s, the Republican voters elected growing numbers of candidates to the U.S. Congress, Texas legislature, and the county courthouse office. So the Republican elected officials began to dominate local politics in the suburban areas around the state. Okay, so Kay Bailey Hutchinson was our first Texas woman in the Senate in 1993. The 1994 election was the last time a Democrat won statewide office. And George W. Bush, who was a Republican, defeated the incumbent Ann Richards, who was a Democrat, in the 1994 governor's race. Okay, so 2000 to 2016, Republican dominance. So conservative Anglo Democrats switched their allegiance to the Republicans. Remember, conservative traditionally value that deregulation of business, right? So they switched their allegiance over to Republicans who also support that same ideal. Texas lawn was dominated by conservatives. We still see a lot of that today. So conservative Democrats had been in a party with the liberal Democrats, but basically they split off and they joined the Republicans, which is what gave the Republicans the majority they needed to basically keep the liberal Democratic influence out of office. So nationally, Bush narrowly defeated Gore for presidency in 2000. Remember, he was a Republican. Texas Governor George W. Bush defeated the Democratic nominee Al Gore by 4 electoral votes. So that's 271 to 267 in the year 2000. So the GOP, that's another name for the Republican Party, they swept all the races in 2002. So that was the next election for Texas. And they gained control of the Texas House and the Senate. So basically what happened was we had a huge Republican win in Washington with George W. Bush. Okay, he had been the governor of Texas, and then whenever we had the midterm elections, that's the one that happens in between 2 presidential elections, when we had our midterm, the Republican Party basically followed that pattern and swept the race again in 2002. Okay, so Obama, the Democratic nominee, right, and our president, did not win Texas in 2008 or 2012. Both those years, the Electoral College votes for Texas went towards the Republican Party. And we have seen this continuing control over all 3 branches of government in 2016. Okay, we saw that control shrink in 2018, which is why the book predicts, and a lot of other political scientists are predicting, that Texas will become more of that swing state because that control is actually starting to lessen. So Democrats are trying to become competitive to align with those demographic changes in states. Okay, so Texas is one of the few states that voted more Democrat in the 2016 presidential election compared to 2012. So Beto O'Rourke, we know him right now, right? He's a major contributor to the Democratic Party of Texas, and he gained national attention, and especially those of the political scientists who are analyzing Texas and analyzing what's going on here. He gained the attention in the 2018 Senate race against Ted Cruz because he only lost by 2.5%. Okay, so we're becoming what is known as a battleground state, and a lot of the Democratic Party, a lot of their efforts have been in registering voters, because being able to register voters means to be able to hopefully gain more support, which is their goal for the Democratic Party. So Wendy Davis, she was the one who campaigned in 2014. So this was a result of the Battleground Texas efforts in 2014. It was disappointing for Democrats because she lost the gubernatorial election by 20%. Remember that gubernatorial means governor. So the analysis basically indicated they did not have a sufficient plan to register and mobilize Latino and African American voters. So our Latino and our African American voters are the ones who tend to vote Democrat. Remember, not all of them, but they tend to vote Democrat. So trying to get more of them mobilized to be able to vote will make huge gains for the Democratic Party, which is what their goal. And then they were trying to reach persuadable white voters. So basically, white voters, at least white males, tend to vote Republican. White females can really go either way. They tend to actually vote Democrat, and so are the younger generations. So this is what's contributing to Texas really starting to become that battleground state. So younger Texans are more likely to identify as Democrats, even the young white voters. And Democrats need at least 35% of the white vote to be competitive, which they have really been trying to do. So the 2018 election offers Texas Democrats electoral hope, because within that election we saw the Texas Democrats, they picked up 12 seats in the Texas House. They picked up 2 U.S. House GOP seats, which means that basically 2 of the House seats from Texas were taken from the Republicans and given to the Democrats. And then, of course, we saw the very narrow defeat for Beto that we just talked about. So party structure. So parties exist on 4 levels. They really follow that system of federalism that we talked about. But remember that system of federalism is basically that breakdown and sharing of power between multiple levels of government. Okay, so we have the national, the state, the county, and the precinct. Precinct, also known as city, or you might also hear it as municipal. They're all interchangeable, all mean the same thing. So organized as a stratarchy. Interesting word to say, right? This is a stratified layered hierarchies, which means that power is diffused among and within levels of a party organization. Okay, so we have the temporary party organization. So these are formed in circumstances that they will only be needed for a short amount of time. Things like primaries and conventions. So conventions, they elect state level and Senate district party officers. They can be scheduled at the precinct level, the county level, the state senatorial district level, and the state level. We also have the party platform, which is adopted at the state convention. So this is basically when all of the parties officials come together and they decide what are they really going to push for that campaign season. Okay, and we have this happen for both our Democrats and our Republican parties. So we have precinct conventions. This occur every even-numbered year on the first Tuesday in March. Usually not a lot of people go, but any citizen who voted in the primary is allowed to go. We have county and senatorial district conventions. So these are held after the precinct conventions. Their main business is to elect delegates for the state convention. And then we have the state convention. So this is held in even number years. So it's the same as the state and national election years. They certify party members nominated in the primaries. They draft and adopt the party platforms. So basically, they decide, okay, this is what we're going to talk about. This is what we're going to push for our campaign. They select the party's state executive committee. They elect delegates to the National Presidential Nominating Convention. Basically, who are they going to send over to Washington to nominate? And the party's national committee. And then they elect the slate of potential presidential electors to cast the state's electoral vote. So basically, that's the electoral college. Who is the state going to use for the electoral college? Okay, so each party has their own set of electoral college votes. Okay, so you have this process happen in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and they stand at the ready for that presidential election to cast the vote on whoever won. Okay, so if the Republicans won Texas, then the Republicans send over their electoral college voters. If it was the Democrats, they send over their electoral college voters. So these electoral votes, remember that they are equal to the number of congressional seats the state of Texas holds. So this means that how many votes we have for the electoral college is equal to the number we have in the U.S. House of Representatives plus 2. Because we always have 2 members in the Senate, right? This means that whenever there's a census, though, that number is going to change, or we'll see it fluctuate. So the selection of National Convention delegates for the presidential nomination. So since 2016, Texas Democrats have used only a presidential preference primary to select national delegates to the National Convention. Individual party members vote directly for the presidential candidates of their choice. The delegates to the party's national convention chosen according to results of the primary vote. And the national conventions nominate parties' candidates for the president and the vice president. So in several states, the parties select delegates to a national convention in what is known as a caucus. Okay? And a caucus is an exclusive meeting between the party and its members. So we have also something known as a superdelegate. So a superdelegate is a state party leader and elected officials automatically seated at the party's national convention. So they're not required to pledge their support for a particular candidate, and they may support any candidate for the party's presidential nomination. Okay? So the Republican selection. So this is the presidential preference for the primary. So the Republican Party selects the national delegates proportionally from results of the presidential preference primary. So this basically just means candidates who finished above 20% of the vote statewide, okay, for the primary. So 3 additional delegates are awarded in each congressional district. So there's just 36 districts. Candidates win all 3 delegates if they clear 50% of the vote in the district. And if no candidate exceeds 50% per the district, then the first place candidate receives 2 delegates and the second place finisher gets 1. So the permanent party organization. So they recruit candidates, devise strategies, raise funds, and register voters. We have something known as the precinct chair. So this organizes voting activities for the party. And we have the county and the district executive committee. So within this, we have the county chair. So this is the key party official, and they serve as the party's chief strategist within that county, meaning that each county is going to have its own chair. Okay, so Senatorial District Executive Committee. And my apologies, I know that this chapter is very information heavy. So it is composed of 1 man and 1 woman from each of the 31 state senatorial districts, okay, plus a chair and a vice chair. One must be a woman and the other must be a man. So the Democratic and the Republican parties, they have state executive committee with 64 members elected. The convention delegates choose the chair and the vice chair during an at-large election. Remember that means everybody together instead of in districts. The party's state chair serves as its key strategist and chief spokesman. So the party rules may allow also add-on members. Okay, so an add-on member may represent the statewide auxiliary organization. So that would be the ones that are outside the main party. Okay, so this would be women's groups like the Texas Democratic Woman, Texas Federation of Republican Women. Racial groups, so this could be the Texas Coalition of Black Democrats, the Hispanic Caucus, the Republican National Hispanic Assembly, the House and Senate caucus chairs, youth groups like Texas Young Democrats and Texas College Republicans, and then also county chairs associations. So Texas Democratic Chairs Association and the Texas Republican County Chairmen's Association. So as you see, both of the parties have their own auxiliary organizations as a fall on the outside, and they both have them in the same categories, just for different parties. So the state executive committee. So this is the highest permanent party organization, meaning that it does not go away. It is always there. There is one man and one woman from each senatorial district. There is a chair and a vice chair, and they are also elected at an at-large convention. Okay? Whew. Okay, so Chapter 5. This is on campaigns and elections. Okay, don't worry, this is on Canvas. I know it is very information heavy. I will be uploading and making sure that it's uploading to YouTube so that way you can also have access to this so you can repeat it over again. So campaigns and elections. So conducting campaigns in the 21st century. So basically our campaigns and the way that they have been carried out has changed in huge ways since our country's creation. Okay, and since our state's creation, right? So we have styles that really cater to different types of media. Okay, so character and political style versus the issues. So character and political style, basically meaning that the person that the candidate portrays themselves as has actually become more important than the issues themselves. Okay, so for example, the Trump supporters were very drawn in by his unorthodox methods and attitude. Usually we have seen, at least tend to see, is our candidates tend to be very reserved. Right? They have very strong opinions, but they tend to be more reserved about them, right? Trump was very much not that traditional style that we were used to. So that was what really drew some people in about him. They knew what they were getting. They knew his opinions. So it was the importance of the media that really fuels our campaigns. We have very many different types. Television, radio, yard signs, bumper stickers, newspapers, billboards, door-to-door canvassers, as the people who come and knock on your door and ask which way you're voting, political information in the mail, social media tools, Facebook and Instagram accounts. We also have iPhone apps now. So we have Twitter, where we have our candidates and our current officials usually make tweets about what's going on. We also have YouTube videos that are created either by people that are running for the campaign and their campaign advisors, or YouTube videos created by people who very much like and or very much dislike a candidate and put it on YouTube. So Twitter has become a huge, huge tool for our political officials. So as you can see in here, these are both tweets by our Attorney General Ken Paxton. So you'll usually see a lot with, especially tweets nowadays, a lot of our politicians have taken Trump's more unorthodox ways, and they've really started to use them themselves to really try and stir up controversy and get support. So over in this one, I'll just read this one for you guys. So, Louis Gohmert himself admits his vanity run isn't about defending Texas and our conservative values. It was never about winning. The establishment talked him into running when it became clear George P. couldn't beat me. Texas will see right through his shameless, cynical game. So, a huge thing we'll also talk about with this is mudslinging. Our campaigns are infamous, both at the state and the national level, for mudslinging, which is when people just basically try to tear their opponent apart. So we have something known as a soundbite. So these are usually very famous. It's a very brief statement. It's usually something you can say and somebody else can finish because it is that known. So for example, John F. Kennedy. Many people know this quote of, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that's something that he really followed in his campaign and throughout his presidency until his unfortunate assassination. But it's something that people for years after that candidate is in office or after that candidate has run in their campaign, it's something that they usually remember about them because it's very short and it's very to the point. So, mudslide campaigns. So, mudslide campaigns, this is the candidate's lowest ethical level of campaigning, and it's known as mudslinging. So, they basically don't really even touch on critical issues, things that people are, really trying to get candidates in to address. It's usually more on character voting consideration. So, in 2018, our gubernatorial election, remember gubernatorial means governor, Republican Governor Greg Abbott and his re-election campaign against the Democratic candidate Lupe Valdez, who was the former Dallas County Sheriff, tweeted, "She can't even keep track of her gun," after reports surfaced that her pistol she was issued while sheriff could not be located. So they posted an online ad questioning her ability to judge and her fitness to serve as a governor if she was unable to keep track of her pistol. She responded that she had returned the pistol, but then it was misplaced during her transition out of office. And she only had a few days of negative coverage for the missing pistol, but the damage had basically already been done. It was a few days after the report of the missing pistol that the office of the Dallas County Sheriff announced that they had located it in the property room. So it had indeed been turned in. They were able to find it at no fault of Valdez of her own, right? But this was already all over the news and social media. So again, the damage had already been done. So campaign reform. So eliminating negative campaigning. So candidates, the media, consultants, and the electorate. So the electorate is all the people in a county or area who are entitled to vote in an election, are all to blame for increase in negative campaigns. This is what your book says. So candidates and consultants, they employ negative advertising and make exaggerated claims. Basically, the thing is, people respond to controversy. They really do. In that drama, people tend to get drawn in by it. They love it. So the media emphasizes this poll results, the horse race appearance of a contest. They tend to not focus on the basic issues and the candidates' personalities that really actually relate to their leadership potential. It's all about just taking them down a rung and trying to make it so that way you look like the better person. So the concern is that negative campaigns lower electoral participation, though, because it turns people off to politics. So, for example, Trump was one of those people in our American government where people either really liked him or they really hated him, right? And so a lot of it had to do with he did a lot of mudslinging. There was a lot of drama, right? And this either pulled people in or really turned them off, okay? So these negative messages addressing relevant topics presented civilly may lead to greater political participation, but since our media really tends to really feed off of that drama, the likelihood of that happening, at least right now, is very, very slim. So increasing free media access. So television is the most important and still most expensive communication tool. It has contributed to partisan, or that means party, polarization. Okay, so remember that partisan polarization means that people who used to identify as moderate Republican have become very extreme Republican, and people who used to identify as moderate Democrat have become very extreme Democrats. So they have gone towards the polls. Okay, and it has to do with the loss of the fairness doctrine. It used to be that up until the 1980s that when a television station, a radio station, when they gave one party a set amount of airtime, they had to do the exact same amount of time for the other party. But after the fairness doctrine was taken away, around 1987, this is whenever we started our stations becoming very partisan. Okay, so this is whenever we saw Fox start to become very conservative and Republican, and when we saw CNN start to become very liberal and Democrat. So our social media is now used by most candidates because it's free publicity, because you don't have to pay for someone to press the share button, right? All you gotta do is click and type in what you want to post, right? And somebody can just share your stuff, and all of a sudden it spreads like wildfire, right? And it's free publicity. Whereas the television and the radio, you have to pay for that airtime, and it can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So our social media is really being used by our political candidates. However, we do have the detriment of fake news within our social media. Why do I say this? Because a lot of our internet, we have a lot of websites we can look at for stuff, right? But not all of them give complete and accurate information. And a lot of the time, people can put news stories and that sort of thing, and they're not under the same scrutiny, meaning that they're not put under that same microscope as our major news stations like Fox and CNN. Fox and CNN, yes, they see things very differently, and yes, they support a particular party, but what they say, it has to actually be based on some type of truth, or they can get sued for slander or libel. Okay, the other lower news stations, basically that regulate off of or get shares off of social media, don't have that same microscope. I'll never forget. I had a student. This is when I was teaching high school, and he said, Miss Bonilla, I saw this news story on Facebook, and it said that Colorado is executing people by ripping their heads off. And I was like, oh, okay, where did you see this story? And so he showed me the story, and I showed him how to fact check what he was reading, right? But not everybody knows to do that. A lot of people just, take it and they read it and they assume that it's complete and accurate information, right? And a lot of people don't have enough time to sit there and sift through all the information and make sure it's correct, right? And so we see a lot of rapid spread of false information. So Trump, when he was running against our Senator Ted Cruz basically put a tweet out that put down Senator Ted Cruz during the Republican Party primary. And people read this tweet and they still use it against him to this day. So that means that 6 years later, they still use it against him to this day. So social media is not only a very powerful and free publicity tool, but it's also one in which that negative information stays on there. So I always tell my students, anything you post, pictures, posts, they are on there for eternity. They do not go away. And your employers will look at your social media pages. I guarantee it, both while you're being hired and while you have your job. So you should always, always, always watch what you are posting because it can be used against you. Okay? So, campaign finance. How much does a campaign cost? It costs a lot. So, record spending in 2002. Okay? 2002 gubernatorial campaign. Unlike the federal government, Texas doesn't really have any laws that limit political contribution, meaning that businesses, individuals can give our candidates a whole lot of unlimited money. Okay? So 2018, the U.S. Senate campaign between Cruz and O'Rourke, so that's Ted Cruz, Beto O'Rourke, was the second most expensive campaign in the nation, okay, after Florida. There was a total of $138 million spent on the election. $124 million was spent by candidates. The other $13 million was spent by outside groups supporting one of the candidates. Okay? So that should tell you right there how expensive all those ads and everything are. And trying to get their people that they're trying to travel and get the word out and all that stuff. It's very expensive. So PACs, these are organizations that are created to collect and distribute political campaigns. These are often more regulated. They donate because they agree with the candidate's position on the issues. Okay? The Texas Ethics Commission. They are responsible for administration and enforcement of the Texas Election Code. This is for campaign fundraising, expenditures, how they spend their money, advertising, ethics of government officials and state employees. So their key responsibilities are collecting and maintaining political fundraising and spending activity reports. Lobbyists are required to file reports of their activities, and we will be talking about those guys. State officials, they have to file personal financial disclosure reports with the commission. I mean, anybody working for the state. And the power of the commission lies in its authority to levy fines for violation. So if a candidate does not report a campaign fundraising donation, they can risk losing that donation due to a fine, right? Because instead of using the money from the donation to pay for their campaign, they're now having to pay the fine, right? So it can be a very powerful tool to try and keep some of them in check. So the Campaign Reform Act 2002. So the U.S. passed the Campaign Reform Act. So this was at the national level, and this was signed into law by President George W. Bush. It prohibited soft money. So that's money used to fund election activities that is not directly donated to a political campaign. Okay? It increased the limits on individual hard money. This is that direct contribution. So the direct contribution of an individual to a candidate or from a business to a candidate, that sort of thing. So they restricted corporations and labor unions' ability to run electioneering ads. So those are basically ads that are for the election, right? Political ads that feature the names or likenesses of candidates close to election day. So, electioneering means to take active part in the activities of an election campaign. Restrictions on donations are limited by federal court decisions. Okay, so plaintiffs, including the former Texas Congressman Ron Paul and others, challenged the constitutionality of this act. One thing you will see throughout this class, I think we've touched on this once before, Texas and the United States butt heads a lot. That means that they are almost always fighting with one another. So you will almost always see Texas trying to challenge what the U.S. government is doing, no matter if they are being controlled by the Republican or the Democratic Party. It doesn't matter. Texas just likes to fight with them. So so they claim that it was an unconstitutional restraint on freedom of speech. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the soft money ban in McConnell v. FEC in 2003. So our campaign finance expenditures, known as independent expenditures, these are our super PACs. So expenditure for communication that expressly advocates for the election or the defeat of a candidate. It is not made in coordination with any candidate or his or her authorized committees or agents, or a political party committee or its agents. Basically, these super PACs try to find ways around different contribution limits, because even though we don't have them at the state level, we do have them at the national level to a point. They do monitor us. So our super PACs will try and find ways around this any way they can to try and get money to that candidate. We have Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. This was in 2010, and this overturned a provision of the act that banned these unlimited independent expenditures made by corporations, unions, and nonprofit organizations in federal elections, meaning that these corporations, these unions could have super PACs in these elections. Okay? So these two here, I'll just show them to you real quick. I outlined the court cases for you guys to have you review. I'm not going to do it during class just because we have 30 slides to go and it's 7 o'clock. So dark money under super PACs. So dark money, this is the political spending by nonprofit groups with the money coming from anonymous sources, because the nonprofits do not have to disclose the sources of their contributions. Okay? Basically meaning that they can get money and they don't have to say where it's coming from. So in 2013, the former governor, Rick Perry, he vetoed a bill that would have required nonprofit organizations spending $25,000 or more on political campaigns to publicly disclose their contributors who donate more than $1,000. Okay? So, because this was vetoed, the Texas Ethics Commission adopted a rule in 2015 to require some disclosure of dark money contributors if they spend money on advertising within 30 days of an election. Okay, so within that final stretch. Opponents of the disclosure, they filed lawsuits in an attempt to defeat the regulation. Basically, their argument was, if you're having to disclose where your money is coming from, it violates your freedom of speech, is what they tied it to, because it's their ability to use their voice and where they want politics to go. So March of 2016, the U.S. District Judge dismissed a lawsuit that challenged the dark money rule as unconstitutional, and additional lawsuits are still pending. So, racial and ethnic politics. So we have LULAC. Okay, so LULAC stands for the League of United Latin American Citizens. This is basically the way I describe it to my students. It's basically like the NAACP for the Hispanic community. Okay, so it's one of the oldest and largest Latino organizations in the United States. Fun fact, my last name is Bonilla, right? The Bonilla family is actually a huge part of LULAC. They're focused on education, employment, and civil rights for Hispanics. They were formally established in Corpus Christi, Texas, in February of 1929. So they had a major impact in Texas beginning in the 1960s to the 1970s. Remember, this is right around that civil rights period, right? Whenever it started to gain momentum in Texas. So 1970s, the La Raza Unida Party elected candidates to local offices in South Texas. If you remember our conversation about the areas of Texas, remember how South Texas, we talked about, they were very much Hispanic centered. A lot of their political officials, a lot of their political candidates are Hispanic. And so a lot of them hold offices down in South Texas. Okay? So it forced the Democratic Party in Texas to begin to address the Mexican American Latino concerns. So let me explain why this is such a big deal in this time period. Remember that 1960s, 1970s, this is when Texas was still trying to keep civil rights to a minimum. They were starting to be able to see, hey, maybe this is an issue, but not to the point of where they would actually do something about it politically, at least not strongly politically. But the Hispanic community was able to get the Democratic Party's attention. So remember the Democratic Party, that's the one that was the most powerful party at that time in Texas. They were able to get their attention, okay, where the Democratic Party's attention had been on the white community, right? So Mexican Americans they continue to be the largest Latino national origin group in Texas. The dominant conservative faction of the Democratic Party had not been concerned with Mexican American issues. But the La Raza Unida Party, they took votes away from the Democrats in the 1970s. And so because of this, the Democratic Party said, we have to start recognizing LULAC's wishes and the La Raza Unida Party's wishes, because if we don't, we're going to lose voters. If we lose voters, that means we're going to lose political power, right? So it became a very powerful movement in the state of Texas. So Anglo candidates now use Spanish phrases in their speeches. They advertise in Spanish language media, on television, radio, newspapers. They voice their concerns for issues important to the Latino community. And during presidential elections, candidates from both major political parties included appearances in Latino communities and national Latino organizations like LULAC and National Council of La Raza as a part of their campaign strategy. Remember, we talked about how within the country that the Hispanic community is one of the quickest growing communities, and they are projected to become the majority community within, I believe it's around 2030 or around 2040. It's pretty soon. So our political parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, are really starting to shift their attention towards this community because they know that they are going to become the swing vote. So Latino community political gains. In 2002, Laredo businessman Tony Sanchez Jr. was the first Latino candidate nominated for governor by a major party in Texas. A challenge for the Democratic nomination by former Texas Attorney General Dan Morales. Two men held the first Spanish-language gubernatorial campaign debate in U.S. history. I mean, the entire debate was in Spanish. So in 2012, the Democratic Party selected the first Latino state chair of a major political party in Texas. We know him as Gilberto Hinojosa for that position. And in 2018, Democrats Sylvia Garcia of Houston and Veronica Escobar of El Paso became the first Latinas elected to the U.S. House from Texas. Lupe Valdez became the first Latina candidate for governor after winning the Democratic nomination, too. So over here, Latino community political gains. What have we seen? So 2 statewide positions, the Commissioner of the General Land Office and 1 Supreme Court Justice. We've seen 1 U.S. Senator, 7 U.S. representative seats in our Texas's congressional delegation, 44 legislative seats in our state level legislature, and more than 2,200 of the remaining elected positions in the state, and a lot of those are in South Texas. So African Americans were not in statewide offices until the 1990s. So we had a lot of very active African Americans, active politically, during Reconstruction. So it was during the 1870s. But whenever the North left the South, whenever all the military officials left and the South was able to function on its own, that's whenever we saw Jim Crow be put into place, and all of a sudden African Americans lost almost their entire political voice. So this is why it took until the 1990s for us to really start to see the African American community really start to participate politically. So 2001, we have Wallace Bernard Jefferson's appointment by Governor Perry to the Texas Supreme Court. He was the first African American to serve on the court. 2002, we saw Jefferson and another African American, Dale Wainwright, elected to the Texas Supreme Court. So that means the Texas level Supreme Court. The former Dallas Mayor Ron Kirk became the first African American nominated by either major party in Texas as his candidate for U.S. Senator. And in 2004, Governor Perry appointed Jefferson as a Chief Justice. So Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio have all had African Americans as their mayors. So since the 1930s, most African American Texans have identified with the Democratic Party because that was the party of the South, and that was the party that they were trying to gain basically access to, because they knew that trying to go with the Republican Party that didn't really have any power in Texas was not going to really do them any good. So they had to try to associate with the Democratic Party and try to get their voice heard with the Democratic Party, so that way they could have their voices heard, hopefully. So after the national civil rights legislation was adopted in the 1960s under the leadership of President Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, Democratic Party identification of African Americans strengthened. So basically, one other thing that happened. 1930s, this is, remember when we had FDR, right? Very strong Democratic president. 1960s, we had President Lyndon Johnson, who was known for expanding those programs from the Great Depression. Okay? So those programs were really supportive of the common American, right? So this is also what really strengthened the relationship between the Democratic Party and the African American community. Okay, so 2018, there was a Senate race survey, and 86% of African Americans intended to vote for O'Rourke and 10% for Cruz. Okay, so that shows you that our African American community tends to vote Democratic to this day. So African Americans, they make up 12% of the total population of Texas and more than 11% of the voting age population. So African Americans had the highest voter turnout with more than 63% in 2012. And both in Texas and nationally, the 2012 presidential election was the first election in which an African American turnout exceeded turnout for all the other groups and was critical to the re-election of President Barack Obama. So African Americans also contributed to the Democratic Party gains in the 2018 midterms, especially for Harris County. Remember Harris County? That's over where Houston is. So by early 2019, Many African American Texans held elective office, including 6 U.S. representative seats in Texas congressional delegation, 17 seats in the Texas legislature, and more than 500 of the remaining elected positions in the state. Okay, so now women in politics. So until 1990, only 4 women held statewide office. So these notable women are Governor Miriam Ma Ferguson from 1925 to 1937, and then again from 1933 to 1935. Governor Ann Richards from 1991 to 1995. U.S. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson from 1993 to 2013, and Mayor Annis Parker of Houston from 2010 to 2016. So there has been a decline in the number of women seeking and being elected to public office at the state level. Reasons for this decline, so women often have that double career burden. I won't say burden, but a double career expectation, right? They're expected to work their job and they're expected to continue to be that more traditional housewife. At least in some households, not everybody, but in a lot of them, they are still more of that more traditional housewife where they're doing the cooking, the cleaning, and all those different things. So because of this, it becomes harder to shoulder a family and a major elected position. So that is one reason. Some mothers feel obliged to care for their children in the home until their children finish high school. So we still do see stay-at-home moms who tend to stay home until their children are out of the house. So parental obligations, together with these age-old prejudices, deny women their rightful place in government. So female candidates, they still get criticized for pursuing professional careers. So in the 2014 gubernatorial election, the Democratic candidate Wendy Davis was accused of abandoning her children because she left them with extended family while she attended Harvard Law School in Massachusetts. Let's ask ourselves, would that have been the same situation if she were the father of the children, right? If she had been a man instead of a woman, right? That attention is not usually put onto that type of issue for men. So it's this double standard. So Republican women have fared better in our statewide races, mostly because they would become more strong whenever the Republican Party became more strong in our state. So obstacles to voting. So universal suffrage was not until the 1960s. Everyone 21 and up had the right to vote until 1971, but there were a lot of obstacles that kept that from happening. So the voting age was not lowered to 18 until July 1971 with the 26th Amendment. Remember, 1971, this is the Vietnam War. Okay, so the thought process was, if you are old enough to die for your country, you are old enough to vote. So they lowered the voting age. The 14th Amendment is what granted equal citizenship to every individual. The 15th Amendment gave every male the right to vote. The 19th Amendment is what gave every woman the right to vote. Okay? We also had the issue of poll taxes and literacy tests. So this also affected our Southern poor whites because a lot of our Southern poor whites were farmers. A lot of them did not go to school, so they could not read, so they could not pass the literacy test, or they could not pay the poll tax. It caused African American participation to lower significantly. They had to pay the poll tax between October 1st to January 31st, and if they could not pay it within that time period, they could not vote for the next 12 months. So the 24th Amendment in January of 1964 finally abolished that poll tax. It had been around, almost 100 years, to participate in a national election. And then Harper v. Virginia State Board of Elections in 1966 took out all the state laws where poll tax had to be paid for state elections. So the grandfather clause, this is what barred basically any African American male because it was around that time period, from voting. The thought process was if their grandfather was a slave, then they were not able to vote. If we're talking about 1870s, 1880s, almost every African American's grandfather had been a slave, right? That meant that most of the community could not vote. We also have modern practices of diluting minority votes, in other words, taking away their voice. One is through gerrymandering, which we talked about last class, where I showed you the picture with the blue and the red areas. So basically, purposefully making it so that way the population's vote is drowned out. So, for example, Republicans have been notorious for, and they still are notorious for, purposefully drawing the lines to cancel out the Democratic Party's votes. We have the at-large elections, which is a citywide election. Remember, that means that it's the entire city instead of it divided into districts. And in this situation, we do have instances where a minority group can be diluted, their voice can be diluted when it is combined with the votes of a majority group. So we had something known as all-white primaries. We do not have this anymore. During this time, Democratic Party was the dominant party in the South, and they disqualified any non-white citizen from voting in the primary. So basically, they could still vote in the Republican primary, but it wasn't going to matter because that's not the party that was going to win the state. So since the Democratic Party was the party of the South Texas, any non-white citizen was essentially unable to participate politically. This was overturned by Smith v. Allwright, 1944. And then we have Shelby v. Holder, 2013. This took out the pre-clearance by the federal government for southern states. So basically, when the southern states redrew their maps, according to the census, they had to send it up to the federal government for a review to make sure that there was no gerrymandering going on, and then they could use that map. Okay, this is no longer the case. They do not have to send their maps up for pre-clearance anymore. But what we are still seeing is that there has still been given preference to different ethnic groups, and so because of this, it has shown evidence for gerrymandering. So it is, of course, back up at the Supreme Court being debated. So these right here I put into the slideshow for you so you can use it for that voter ID law. I am going to skip over it. It's just basically showing what types of identification you can use to be able to vote whenever you go to the voter station. And then alternate identification of what you can use. Okay? So Texas voter ID law. The requirement to have a voter ID. This disproportionately affects the elderly, minorities, and low-income Americans. 18%, or almost 6 million, citizens over age 65 do not have a photo ID. 16% of Latino voters do not have a government-issued photo ID. 25% of voting age African Americans, that's 5.5 million people, do not have an ID. And 15% of voting age Americans who earn less than $35,000 do not have an ID. Why? So voters in strict voter ID laws they have to be aware of the type of IDs required to vote. They have to obtain the right documentation. They have to pay the cost of replacing any lost documentation, and they have to secure transportation. If someone's doesn't have a car or a reliable access to transportation, especially in the state of Texas, right, where you really have to have a car in order to be able to get anywhere, basically, it's going to be hard enough for them to get to the office, let alone all the hoops you have to hop through to be able to get your IDs. You know, with a GPS, they can all of a sudden need something different every single time you go there, right? So you can imagine how much it would be harder for someone who has a harder time getting there in the first place, or taking off work to get there because they're not open during the weekend, right? So Voting Rights Act of 1965. So basically this was a blanket law that took out all of those pre-clearance things. so that way everybody could practice their right to vote. It abolished the use of all literacy tests and voter registration. It prohibited residency requirements of more than 30 days for voting in presidential elections. It requires states to provide some form of absentee or early voting. It allows individuals as well as the U.S. Department of Justice to sue in federal court to request that voting examiners be sent to a particular area. In other words, if you feel like your area, your county, is not following voter regulation laws, then you can report them. It requires bilingual ballots and other written election materials in areas where a significant part of the population is non-English speaking. So in most of Texas, the ballot is in English and Spanish, and in Houston, it's in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So, democratization of the ballot. So basically, this is just talking about how there was a law put into place where it's called the motor voter law. And basically, whenever you go to any type of government office, whether that be DPS, military recruitment, disability assistance, any type of welfare office like Medicaid or WIC, they have to give you an option to register to vote. If you register or if you apply online, they also give you an option to have a voter registration card sent to your home too. And that is part of that motor voter law. So, two trends in suffrage, steadily expanding to all persons. So, remember, suffrage, that's that right to vote, has steadily expanded over time. It was not one final law. There was basically a process of laws that had to be passed in order to open up the vote to everybody. Okay? Movement toward uniformity in all states. So the movement toward uniformity of voting policies among the 50 states. This really happened with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is enforced by the U.S. Congress, the federal judges, and our presidents. So in Texas, our turnout is higher in presidential election years. That's because people give most of their attention to the presidential election. It's lower than the national average. Texas averages around 51.4%. That means that those who have registered to vote, only about 51.4% vote. The national average is 60.1%. So practices that lead to higher voter turnout. Same-day online voter registration. Mail-in ballots for all voters. These are used in Washington, Oregon, and California, which have higher voter turnouts, but not in Texas. And 14% of our residents are ineligible because of citizenship status. So education is the strongest influence on voting. Those who tend to be more educated tend to be more likely to vote. That's because you've taken classes like this, right, where you know the importance of voting and participating and paying attention to what's going on, right? So you're more able to understand political parties, candidates, what issues actually entail. It strengthens political efficacy, meaning that it strengthens your ability to be politically effective. Income strongly affects voter turnout too, because think about it this way. When you make a higher income, right, is that income usually salary or hourly? For that higher income, it's usually salary, right? Which means that if you miss a day to go vote, you're not going to be losing pay, right? Versus someone who is making an hourly wage, however many hours it takes them to go vote, right? Especially on a day where maybe there's a whole bunch of people voting that day. They're losing that money, right? And then people who are hourly also usually live paycheck to paycheck. So it's really hard to take that pay cut to be able to go vote, okay? So to show you just how much we see this phenomenon. Starr County, this is a very rural county. Their median household income is $27,000. Their registered voter turnout is only 32%. Collin County, remember that's over by Frisco, their median income is $90,000 and their turnout is 61%. So as you can see, there is a huge difference depending on income. Okay? So, factors influencing voting. Voter fatigue. There are a lot of elections. We have municipal, county, state, national, primary, special, and all kinds of other elections. And so a lot of these people really start to get electioned out. They start to get overwhelmed. They start to get tired of it. And so they stop paying as much attention. So this is why you see people usually start to make priorities, right? And that usually falls with the national election, sometimes with the state election. You rarely see it at the municipal election because there's usually no parties associated with those candidates, meaning that you have to actually research it. People don't like to have to do that, so they don't show up to it. Psychological factors, beliefs in political efficacy, so it means your ability to influence political officials via your vote. Beliefs in civic duty. Those who are very strong Democrats, those who are very strong Republicans, usually have a very strong belief in civic duty, which is your duty as a U.S. citizen to vote. So that's, of course, also that strong partisan political party support. Losing my voice. Okay, so factors influencing voting. I'm going to skip over this one because we just talked about it with the cost. Gender and age. Women are more likely to vote than men. Also, African Americans are more likely to vote than other racial groups. Reasons why on this, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because what two groups have gotten their right to vote the most recently in history? Women and African Americans, right? So then it would make sense why you see a lot more political turnout for these groups because we fought so hard to get it, right? So state responsibility, Texas Election Code, in the Texas Constitution. The legislature is responsible for the administration of the elections. In other words, they are the ones over how our elections are carried out. The state lawmakers made Secretary of State Chief Elections Officer. Our county officials administer the elections, and the administration of elections is decentralized because they're done at the county level, right? Which means there's 254 different administrations of the elections, right? Instead of just one. So that is why they say it is decentralized. So to be eligible to vote in Texas, you must meet the following qualifications. You have to be native born or a naturalized citizen of the U.S. Be at least 18 years of age on election day. Be a resident of the state and the county for at least 30 days. Be a resident of the area covered by the election on election day, meaning that if you are living in Tarrant County, you cannot go vote in Denton County. You have to go vote in Tarrant County. Be a registered voter for at least 30 days immediately before the election day. You cannot be a convicted felon unless your sentence, probation, or parole are completed. And you cannot be declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. So, our election officials, we have the election administrator who prepares the general election and the special election ballots. The special election is held between general elections. We will go over what that is whenever we talk about the legislature and the governor. So the election judge administers elections in each precinct for a max term of 2 years. They can hire clerks to assist in general and special elections in the precinct. And remember that that precinct is the district of a city or a town. Okay? You'll know what precinct you're in by the police, right? You usually see when you're driving around in your area, you see the police cars have, different areas labeled on their car, right? That is the precinct that you are in, okay? So voting systems, there's a paper ballot, there's an optical scan, which no is not a scan of your eye, it's just a Scantron, and a touch screen known as a DRE. The county commissioner's court determines which system will be used, meaning that it is different for each county. Advantages and disadvantages are the ballot and equipment costs, ease of use for voters for each of these types, accuracy of counting for each of these types, labor cost. Obviously, a touchscreen is going to be a lot faster labor and cheaper labor than a paper ballot where someone's going to have to sit there and count each vote by hand, right? So, of course, and then also the time required to count votes. So, voting early. This can be held 17 days before an election, 12 days before a May election or a runoff, 10 days before runoffs and all other elections, and it ends 4 days before any election or primary. In rural counties, early voting occurs at courthouses. In urban areas like where we live in Tarrant County, the county clerk's office runs branch offices. So you can see these at malls, schools, college campuses, mobile units. So you'll see these early voting at places like TCC whenever you go vote in this November election, right? So polling places are open weekdays during regular business hours of the official conducting the election. So obviously the malls are going to be open later than the schools or college campuses for the most part. So voting precinct, this is the basic geographic area for conducting a primary or an election. It's between 100 and 2,000 registered voters of Texas. We have more than 8,500 voting precincts. Citizens vote at polling places within your voting precinct. The voting centers, most Texas counties use voting precincts. They can eliminate voting precincts and establish a county-wide voting center, which some of ours have done. Election officers, election workers electronically verify their voters' eligibility. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. More than 50 counties, including Galveston, Collin, and Brazos, use voting centers. So, development of direct primaries. So a primary, remember, that is where the political party chooses their candidates. They have a list of candidates, right, that they give you to choose from. The one who gets both the top votes for both parties are the ones who run in the election. So, for example, Abbott won our Republican. Beto won the Democrat. So they are the ones who are going to be running off in the general election in November. So a runoff. This means that more than 50% is required for a nomination. If we have a primary and no candidate gets above 50%, then there is a runoff primary held on the fourth Tuesday in May. So it allows the party to choose candidates from the party's top 2 candidates. Basically, for the first primary, the 2 candidates who get the 2 top percentages then go to runoff in what is known as a runoff primary. The one who wins that then wins the party's nomination. Okay? So, 5 more slides to go. So, development of direct primaries. We have closed. So, this requires voters to declare their party affiliation when they register to vote. They must show the party ID when voting in a primary election. They can vote only in the party primary for which they are registered. Texas uses a combination of open and closed primaries. So, open is when it does not require a party ID of voters, and voters in open primary can choose a ballot for either party, regardless of party affiliation. So what happens in Texas, usually the Democratic or the Republican Party, they choose which type they're going to use for each primary. So they don't really decide until that year's primary which type they're going to use. So the top 2 were the jungle primaries. So voters receive a ballot with all the candidate names from all the parties, and they all run in a single election. So if a candidate receives more than 50% of the vote, they're declared the winner. If no candidate receives more than 50%, then the top 2 vote getters participate in a runoff election. Okay? So, Texas primaries. We have something known as crossover voting, because remember, we do have open and closed. So, Texas Republicans are more likely to engage in crossover voting, which is whenever they go to the Democratic part and try to basically pick the Democratic candidate that they want to run against the Republican candidate, that will most likely let their Republican candidate win. So, Democrats in Republican-dominated counties such as Collin, Denton, Midland, Montgomery, and Williamson are also more likely to participate in the crossover voting with the same goal, just opposite. So, Texas election code requires declaring a party. So the Texas election code requires voters to identify their party affiliation at the time of voting. Okay, so Texas is a combination of a closed primary state and open primary state. The voter registration certificate stamped with the party name whenever they visit in the primary. And then the qualified voters may vote in the primary of any party as long as they have not already voted in another party's primary or participated in another party's convention in the same year. Okay? So one thing to note with this is that Texas does not require you to declare a party when you are registering to vote. But they do pay attention to which way you vote. Reason why I say this is because you'll notice that your voter registration card comes either orange for Republican or blue for Democrat. So my card, this is why I know this, and I've asked around, a whole bunch of other people notice the same pattern. My card was one color, I'm not going to say what it was, and then whenever I went to vote, I got a new one in the mail with the opposite color. So Texas does pay attention to how you vote and what party your name is associated with. So administering primaries, how do they do this? So the individuals who want to run in a direct primary, they file the papers with the party state chair. The party official certifies the names of the persons to the county chair. The county executive committees for the political party supervise the printing of the primary ballots. And with the state executive committee, county executive committee determines order of names of the candidates on the ballot and the canvases. So the canvases, they scrutinize results of the election and they confirm and certify the vote tally for each candidate. Okay, so these are the guys who have basically the certified number that you'll see on the news station whenever you check to see how the election is going. So financing primaries, expenses, what do they have to pay for in order to be able to hold this? They have to rent a facility. They have to print ballots, so they have to have all that paper, right? And other election materials. They have to pay the election judges and the clerks for their time. So approximately 30% of the cost of holding Texas primaries comes from filing fees paid by the candidates, and then the balance of expenses is usually paid by the state of Texas. Last slide. So general and special elections. So the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November of even numbered years is when we have our elections. So it's known as an off-year election for our Texas governor and a statewide office holders. And this is because it is between the major presidential elections. Okay, so for example, we had a presidential election 2012. 2014 is when we had our state election. 2016 we had the presidential election. 2018 is when we had our state election, so on and so forth. Okay, the special elections, these are for constitutional amendments, which we will cover when we talk about the legislative branch, local bond issues, interim vacancies in legislative and congressional districts, which we will also talk about, and if no candidate obtains majority in a special election, then we have a runoff contest between the top two contenders that must be conducted to determine a winner. Okay, so I will be processing this, adding it to YouTube for you guys, and other than that, that is it, guys. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week.